My interest in spirituality began during that time. I went through a health crisis. And as I was traversing that health crisis, I encountered loving, kind teachers and masters that showed me the benefits of spirituality.
As you dive into this nexus between high consciousness and business, do you find yourself alone?
Instead of having the core of your economic theory be a utility maximizing, self interested individual or a profit maximizing, self interested company, why doesn't the start point be a fully conscious human being?
Welcome to the Spirituality in Leadership podcast, hosted by Andrew Cohn. Andrew is a trusted counselor, coach, and consultant who works with leaders and teams to increase productivity and fulfillment in the workplace. If you'd like to connect with Andrew about individual or team coaching, leadership workshops, or team alignment, please go to www.lighthouseteams.com. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, I speak with Bond Snodgrass. Bond's a different kind of guest. I'm so grateful to have him on the podcast. Bond is a banker, economist, commentator about economics and the role of economics in society, the connection between economics and spirituality, and as he talks about it, a more expanded notion of economic relationships. And he has a delightful regular column essay called Awakened Economics. And he talks about what that is, how he came to create that. He talks about shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism more broadly. And he just brings a very somewhat academic, but very practical view and broad view about the role of economics in our lives, about how we can interact with economic markets in more conscious ways and what that means for leading ourselves and our businesses and even our countries. It's a fascinating conversation with Bond Snodgrass. Enjoy. In this episode of the podcast, I speak with Bond Snodgrass, and Bond brings a different perspective, a fresh perspective to some very practical things and very, as well as some very academic and theoretical things. Really looking forward to our conversation. Bond and I go back a ways, which we may talk about a little bit, but I'm much more interested in hearing about what you're doing now. And Bond is a banking executive, an entrepreneur. His latest initiative is Sustain Array, which provides sustainability guides for businesses. It's sort of a clearinghouse for sustainability resources in North America, if not globally, and perhaps you can clarify that for us. And you also have a wonderful column and voice in the world with Awakened Economics, which also gets my attention as an economics, international relations I don't want to say scholar, that would be insane for me to use the word scholar for myself, but student at one point in time and still student. And I really appreciate the varied and interesting and wise perspectives you have about these topics. So let's get into some of this. But Bond, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
So what has brought you, maybe you could talk a bit about your career and what's brought you to this place where some of what you're doing, I believe, really touches on the connection between spirituality, broadly defined, and leadership, societal leadership, perhaps business leadership as well. So tell us a little bit about your journey, please.
My professional life is primarily as a banker. I worked at large global investment banks for about 20 years. During that time, I was mostly in equity capital markets, more specifically in Latin American equities and emerging market equities. And I spent time as a senior sell-side equity analyst. In other words, I analyzed big companies that quoted on Latin American stock exchanges, wrote reports for investors, valued them, made recommendations, and did that for about half of this career that I'm mentioning. And then for the other half, I migrated to sales. It's a role called institutional equity sales. And in that case, what I would do is I would take the product that was developed by our research analysts and sell it into large institutional asset managers, primarily in the United States, but also in the UK, Europe, and in Latin America. So that is where my business grounding comes from, primarily in financial services. And then within that, analyzing companies in multiple industries, industrials, construction, consumer products, financial services, transportation. And so it brought me a pretty broad view of what businesses and business models are. No? My interest in spirituality began during that time. I went through a health crisis, and as I was traversing that health crisis, I encountered loving, kind teachers and masters that showed me the benefits of spirituality, and the connection. We were just talking about the mind-body connection before we started recording, the connection between physical well-being and spiritual well-being. And I've always been quite an enthusiastic student. So once I began to realize that this infinite resource was available, I dove in and spent a lot of years on my own, exploring different spiritual traditions, different, comparative theology, comparative religion. And I was also an economics major, rewinding prior to my time in business. At Boston University, I majored in economics and international relations. And I loved it. I enjoyed that thoroughly. But as I was traversing this this path, the spiritual path, and coming into contact with this depth of wisdom and knowledge, I noticed a pretty glaring contradiction between what I was learning, what I'd learned from economists, or from economics, and how economics measure growth, and then what my spiritual teachers and masters were teaching me about how spirituality measures growth. And one day I realized that if every person in the world at the same time, the thought experiment here, if every person in the world at the same time were to have a spiritual awakening and became less interested in consumption for consumption's sakes, but as a result of that became happier, healthy, more connected people, economists would consider that an absolute disaster.
Right.
It would be measured as a crisis of the highest order if people decided to consume less. And so this caused me to kind of revisit a lot of what I learned in economics. And I began to explore both, economics and spirituality. Do they have anything to say to each other? And out of that emerged this project called Awakened Economics, which you mentioned, which is now on Substack, Awakened Economics on Substack. And so that is kind of one vector. Now, how I became interested in spirituality and then spirituality and economics. But returning to the business element of it, I became interested in the idea of high consciousness thought in business. And so this is where we're going to begin to talk a little bit about spirituality, leadership, business. And I became interested in something that I vaguely called high consciousness thought in business. And to me, high consciousness and spirituality are the same thing. And what do I mean by spirituality in this case? To me, spirituality, or the way I'll talk about it in this conversation, is simply transcending the limits of self and ego and feeling a deep connection with yourself, with others. I'm sorry, feeling a deep connection with others, with your surroundings, realizing that Andrew's well-being is related to my well-being, the well-being of my community, of my family, of my neighborhood, of my city, of my state, of my country, of the planet. The well-being of others is also important to my well-being. And so that's the outcome of spirituality, this deep sense of connection with others and with your surroundings. No, so in the business world, I began to ask myself, well, how can we bring this to bear in the business world? And the business world is very different from the world of spirituality. If you think of the spirituality as kind of the invisible world, morals, values, and business on the other side is very practical. And businesses at the end of the day have to generate a profit. Now and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. Business needs profit. Business has to make money in order to survive. No, it's just it goes without saying. But can the search for profit somehow or another be influenced by spirituality? Can you have a high consciousness approach to business? And fast forward to where we are right now, and the answer is yes, you can. Yes, you can. No, and what I realized the connection, the way that high consciousness thought, as I was thinking about it, manifests in the business world now is in sustainability. Okay, in sustainable business practices. And in turn, the way managers within these businesses lead and provide leadership can also be influenced by higher consciousness, by spirituality, and by sustainable practices as well. So I don't know if I made sense there to try to weave these three themes together, but I'll just pause there and see if that was an adequate introduction.
Yeah, I think so. No, beautiful. There's a lot to talk about from what you've just shared. And perhaps the place I would start is as you dive into this nexus between high consciousness and business, do you find yourself alone? Do you find fellow travelers on the way? Are you operating in fallow ground, or are you finding connections and resources? I'm curious to know what this journey has been like for you, and is there that connection and community on the way, or perhaps not yet?
No, that's a great question, and the answer is that there's very much a connection. No, it's the answer is yes. There's a lot of people in this space. Things are changing. There's a lot of change, a lot of wonderful, smart, mission-driven, purpose-driven businessmen and women who are precisely trying to change the way to change business practices in a more sustainable direction. So it's a whole movement. I could, sustainability has evolved towards a science. You can now get master's degrees in sustainable development. There's bachelor's degrees in the subject, and on the more philosophical, theoretical side, for example, there's a movement called conscious capitalism, which was started by the founder of Whole Foods and a colleague, and they tried to bring about change in the way businesses operate and think about themselves. And the phrase that is used to capture this idea, there's a lot of vocabulary, new vocabulary around it, is stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. And in turn, this informs sustainability best practices as well. So in shareholder capitalism, the idea is that you have to make as much money for the owners of the company as possible. That's it. And the only interest group in this way of doing things are the owners, the shareholders of the company. So the manager, the employees are all in service to maximizing profit for the owners. And that's called shareholder capitalism. On the other hand, stakeholder capitalism is the idea that the owners are a very important and vital group, But so too are the employees, so too are the suppliers, so too are the families of the employees, so too are the regulators, so too is the community in which the physical assets of a company may be located, so too is the environment, where the company operates, right? So you expand the vision away from make the most amount of money possible, maximize profit for the shareholders, to the idea of no, this business operates in a larger ecosystem, in a larger environment. And so there you have the idea of stakeholder capitalism.
And the opportunity to be conscious of the needs of these different stakeholders and the interests of these different stakeholders rather than simply the single focused on shareholders.
That's exactly right. Now, so sustainability, and then I want to get into the idea, and then segue back to spirituality and leadership. So once you start thinking about stakeholders instead of just the shareholders, then you've taken a step towards higher consciousness and a step towards deeper connections within the company. And I think that's very vital and very important. No? And so sustainability, as it's thought of, has three components. The way we think about sustainability now, corporate sustainability, and those three components are social, environmental, and economic. Right. So the economic portion covers what we traditionally think of as the primary role of business, which is to make money, because you got to make money. A company has to be profitable, or else it's going to die. You need your cash inflows to exceed your cash outflows. It's pretty basic math, right? So that's the economic portion. But the environmental portion is also what we traditionally, which is what is my environmental footprint? And the two major metric there, emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions, your carbon footprint, and your water usage, your water footprint, and how you use resources. And there's a lot of work that's done in that space. You may have heard of, for example, of the circular economy. No, the circular economy experts take it a bit deeper, but the famous 3 Rs, reduce, reuse, recycle. No, that's a part of environmental sustainability. And then there is social sustainability as well, right? So those are the three elements. And I would say if the number one, the most important element in any social sustainability framework is human rights. Okay, it's human rights, right? My workers are my employees, my regulators. They're human beings, and they have certain rights. So you get back to the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. There's a lot that you could take. There's the International Labor Association has wonderful metrics that you can use to ensure that you're treating your employees to the best of your ability, with compassion and with care, and taking into account their interests, right? So again, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. At some point, you get into an alphabet soup of acronyms and complexity and so forth. But at its most basic level, it's corporate sustainability is those three elements of social, economic, and environmental. And even if we can take a step back even further, like what is sustainability? The definition that's most commonly used is quite simple and elegant, and it comes from a United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development from, I think it was 1987. It's very famous. It's called the Brundtland Commission. The Brundtland Commission, and they said more or less, I hope the words get it right here. They said that sustainability is meeting the needs of the current generation without putting at risk the ability of future generations to meet their needs as well. Okay, so that's what sustainability is. So as you can see there's this wonderful circle, wonderful set of connections between sustainability, higher consciousness, spirituality. When you think of it as simply this deep sense of connection between all people on the planet, and business, right? So that's kind of how all of it flows together.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Wow, lot to unpack there. And just to ask another broad question, and all of this is happening on the theoretical, conceptual level. Isn't this interesting? read a magazine article on the weekends. But how does this come into an impact, or how should it come in and impact leaders, particularly in the business space, but also potentially in the political sphere? I mean, this is a very broad question, I understand, but as you know, my work is primarily in the corporate world, not entirely with leaders at various levels, including very high-level leaders in the business world, trying to execute on strategy to make profit, try to balance the needs of sustainability with the needs of, quarterly earnings, which is the big bugaboo that people talk about, and the reality of many businesses. I'm not here to vilify that, but just to acknowledge and recognize. So I'm curious to know your thoughts about the balance that leaders walk between honoring the needs of sustainability, the imperative of sustainability broadly defined, with their day jobs, not to mention supporting the people who are in their organizations for whom they provide work and vision and et cetera. Where would you go with that?
That's a great question. The answer is that part of the answer, first off, is that me personally, I believe in progress, right? If you've done nothing today and you've done a little bit tomorrow, you've made progress. Even though, if you were to map out the entirety of the shoulds, it should be like this, or maybe we're falling short, but we've made progress, right? So I'm a believer in taking steps towards progress. A simple commitment by the CEO to think about these issues is progress. Because suddenly if the CEO suddenly says, "Oh, this makes sense. I need to think about this," and realize the business benefit of doing so. Because sustainability companies tend to have lower employee turnover. They're more innovative when there's a commitment to sustainability, because employees feel like they're a part of something, right? They feel like that their voice counts. So just if you're working with a CEO, if he or she makes a commitment, then that's progress, right? Now, what that commitment looks like, and what the CEO actually, he or she decides to execute, there's a huge menu of possibilities. I will say, if you go right now and look at pretty much every single publicly listed company in the United States, definitely in Europe, and in capital markets all over the world, some huge percentage, I'm going to say above 90%, have a sustainability report now in their financial statements. In their none of their financial statements. This is sustainability reporting, so it's complementary to financial statements. But they have sustainability reports or ESG reports. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's a manifestation of sustainability in the corporate world. The overarching theme is sustainability, and then sustainability has a lot of paths towards implementation. And one of the paths towards implementation has been this movement called ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So most publicly traded companies in the United States have an ESG report, and they do it voluntarily, because there is no regulation right now in the United States that requires companies to do an ESG report. So why have companies decided to do this? Because investors ask for it. And a lot of times consumers as well. So if a consumer, especially Gen Z, Gen Z is really Gen Z, and even millennials in particular, want their companies to show some kind of commitment to sustainability. So investors are concerned about it, and there's an organization called the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, which operates in the UN, and some huge amount of global asset managers have signed up for the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, right? And this including ESG elements as you analyze companies, right? So suddenly investors are asking corporates, what is your ESG policy? And the corporates say, oh, well, if the market cares about this, I better care about it. So that's been kind of the way that manifested, and it's happened fast. It's been really, really fast. I would say, sustainability, as we're talking about it now, Andrew, it's a very much a 21st century phenomenon. If you go back into the 20th century, there was some talk of it, like corporate social responsibility, Ben and Jerry's, and all those companies. And if you go back even further, it manifested in the form of philanthropy. But philanthropy and sustainability are not the same thing. But in the 21st century, it's really, really taken off. No, it's really been a phenomenon. And so, ESG, for example, among investors as an asset class, ESG labeled mutual funds and ETFs and exchange traded funds, so forth, has just exploded. I'm not exaggerating when I say it's probably over $1 trillion in money that is in ESG related, ESG labeled funds. For those that follow these things, there have been some pushback among politicians, among certain politicians, when ESG when an ESG mandate has taken an exclusionary approach, right? Because there's different ways to implement sustainable investing, and one of them is on an exclusion basis, no? And so you may have heard that there are some funds. I mean, the classics are, for example, gambling stocks or marijuana.
Exclusionary meaning thou shalt not invest in X.
Exclusionary meaning thou shalt
Okay.
not invest in X, right?
Okay.
And that is one approach to sustainable investing.
Sure.
And so, politicians that are supportive of fossil fuel companies took umbrage at that, objection to that, and say, hey, wait a minute here. This is oil and gas is in the sustainability world, oil and gas is not demonized at all. They're called hard to abate sectors. They're called hard to abate. And sustainability is about what can we do with what there is. It's not about value judgments. It's about how do you engage in best practices, because the world needs oil and gas. I'm sorry, but it does. We're not there yet. So anyway, there's been some umbrage in among certain politicians that said, wait, if this means excluding oil and gas, I'm against it. So there was a lot of pushback in ESG, but that's fine. You just have to adapt. And I say, no. What we mean is, we're talking about measurement. We're talking about risk management. We're talking about helping hard to abate sectors do the best that they can with what they have, et cetera. No, but I'm getting a little bit distracted. The point I want to make is that you asked, is this a lonely road? Or is there a lot of company? And the answer is there's a lot of company. This has become an industry. This has become a new way of doing business, and it's happened so fast, and I think that's wonderful. It happened fast, and that's both good. Well, I don't like to use judgment words. It's been phenomenal to watch, but it's also come with some complications, and I'll tell you what one of them has been in the sustainability space. Because this is also new, there have been a lot of players. I shouldn't use the word players. A lot of well-intentioned organizations, because player implies it has a negative connotation, like gambling and so forth. A lot of organizations have stepped into this space to try to put some order into it, right?
A lot of actors in the space, perhaps.
Actors in the space, right? And I don't want to get into the whole alphabet soup, but there's the Sustainable Economy Standards Board, there's the Global Reporting Initiative, there's the International Sustainability Standards Board. There's a lot of there's the TCFD. It's an alphabet soup of organizations that have gotten into this. So if you're a corporation, but the point is there's no common framework that every company can apply, right? It's still voluntary, and there's a lot of alternatives about how to apply it. So for the corporate, even though you may want to do good and get involved and be a more sustainable company, you look at the ecosystem and you say, well, do I do this one? Do I choose this one? Do I choose A? Do I choose B? Do I choose C? Do I choose D? And investors are saying, just choose one of them, do something. And so it becomes confusing and maybe a little bit frustrating for the corporate, because when it's financial accounting, you know what? It's GAAP, In the
There's
United
one
States,
standard, right?
everybody uses GAAP in the US or IFRS in the rest of the world, in most of the rest of the world, right? So you know what? It's the same standard for every single company in the market. And it's not like that way in sustainability. So that's been another source of tension and frustration. However, we're not alone in this. There's been a lot of wonderful work in this space.
So what I'm hearing is one of the consequences of the rush into the space from different actors, perhaps from different spheres and spaces and intentions, and maybe even values that may differ from some of them. It makes it difficult for a corporation to say, okay, we know what the right thing to do is because there's one loud, singular, coherent voice. When does that happen in our world anymore? Probably not too often, but there's one loud, coherent, single voice. That's what we're going with. That's what we want to abide by. But that's more difficult as a result of the flood of participants in the space, which is a consequence of the fast growth of the movement, perhaps.
You said it perfectly. Thank you.
So how do you and what would you say, and this is another broad question, but this is such a broad topic, but how would you speak with business leaders who would say it's not realistic, we're going to lose money, and or it's difficult to be compliant with something that doesn't have a clear single voice? Perhaps compliance isn't even the right word, but maybe aligned with something that way. But what are your kind of major responses, which I'm sure you speak about a lot, to those who push back and say, this is a social initiative, this is a weekend initiative, this doesn't really help business, this is going to cost us in the long term?
Right. That's another great question. Well, if somebody definitely want to hear about it, then there's no need to have that conversation, because you know what, it's voluntary, and if you feel it, that's fine. Like, okay, that's I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to. That's absolutely fine. Go ahead.
So you're not an evangelist.
I'm not an
way.
evangelist, exactly. So if somebody comes to me and says, no, sustainability is it's not worth it. It's going to cost us money. It's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's a pain in my rear end or whatever. I've got much higher priorities than this. Don't say, okay, that's fine. No, that's fine. There's nothing because it is still in many jurisdictions. It's still a voluntary initiative, Andrew. It's still there's a except in Europe. In Europe, it's highly regulated. In Europe, everybody has to do it, and the number of companies, the level. In other words, in terms of revenue, $1 million in revenues is descending. In other words, it's not at the small and mid-sized company business level, but it is, there's a lot of regulations that say you do have to go down to you have to be involved in this. In Europe, it is regulatory, but not in the United States, not in Latin America, and not in other jurisdictions, right? So if a corporate leader says to me, what you just said, I'm not going to do this, I think that's fine. No, if a corporate leader says, well, why should I do this? What is in it for me? That's a different question, and then we can have a conversation.
Fair. And that conversation would be?
Well, you would say some of the point out some of the studies. What the data is showing. And what the data tends to show is that sustainable companies, again, I mentioned on the social sustainability allows you to attract talent, especially younger talent. They want to be in a company that is purpose driven, has meaning.
So your company is more desirable as an employer.
It makes you more desirable as an employer. Thank you.
Got it.
Very well.
Yep. What else?
It reduced. Excuse me.
I'm sorry. I just said what else?
Oh, it reduces turnover. Because your voice is you consider yourself that you're part of something larger. It also can reduce costs, right? And how does that work? Well, if you measure your carbon footprint and your water footprint, you can identify opportunities to reduce your energy expense, particularly in energy intensive businesses. Another one is you can identify new business opportunities. So I'll just throw out, some, like you might have heard of ecotourism, That's something that travel companies, green labeled products. So there are companies out there, for example, or certifying organizations that help seafood companies, for example, say that this is this salmon has been sustainably farmed, or this shrimp farm, or this has come from a sustainable aquaculture operation. So that's that label is something that consumers may find more appealing. No, and so those that would be part of the argument. No, and then it enhances a company's reputational capital as well, makes them more
Yeah.
attractive to investors, makes them eligible. It can bring down your financing costs because normally, there are banks that offer sustainable finance products, and what is that? It's sustainability linked credits or bonds. If you're a big company, sustainable green bonds, social bonds, sustainability linked credits. And if you have a sustainable program, corporate sustainability program in the entity, then your banks and your sources of financing can give you a preferential rate, a lower interest rate and so forth, because you're a less risky credit because you've taken all these measures to strengthen the company. So these would be some of the benefits. I don't know if I answered well or not.
Yeah, definitely. So in that last one, that's interesting. So there's even a competitive advantage financially in terms of credit markets to be playing in some of these spaces.
Yeah. It's a vertical or an approach to finance called sustainable finance.
Hmm. And where you were talking about some of these agencies that do green labeling or otherwise ways to meet certain levels of accomplishment in the sustainability space broadly. Where does that tend to be? You mentioned Europe. Is it for example, you're in Mexico City today. Is it different in Mexico City as compared to the US? Or maybe it's so fuzzy. I'm sure you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, no, it's for big companies, for companies that access capital markets. Yeah, your investment bank will definitely offer you, the chance to issue a green bond or a sustainability linked bond or a social bond. Usually, these are associated. What matters there is the use of resources, right? So, for example, you can issue a blue bond if you're gonna invest the money in, let's say, a water treatment plant, right? Or a green bond if you're gonna invest the money in, let's say, a solar panel field. In other words, if the use of proceeds are clearly linked to an environmental or social project, then you can call it a green bond or a sustainability bond or a social bond, and issue that on capital markets, right? And these are called labeled credits. There's also something called linked sustainability linked credits, and in the bank credit market, what you can do is you can go to the issuer or the borrower, and you can say to the borrower, look, if you meet certain social metrics, then I'll give you a more favorable interest rate. In other words, you can use the money for whatever you want, working capital, what have you. But if you, so let's say that, I'm going to give you this credit of $10 million. And after 1 year, you will show to me that you've measured your carbon footprint, let's say, you've measured your carbon footprint. Then I will step down your interest rate by 5 basis points or something like that. That's called sustainability linked. And at the end of that time, the borrower says, "Yeah, I measured my carbon footprint, and I also took these measures to lower my carbon footprint." So that's linked to actions taken by the borrower, as opposed to funds to finance a project, a specific project. I don't know. Did I explain that
Yeah,
well?
absolutely. It sounds like that's more like an incentive to move more towards more sustainable operations, which becomes more attractive financially. And I might liken it to, a food store that says, well, we're going to just stock a certain number of organic products because it makes us more appealing to the customer, for customers to know. And then, of course, you track, are people buying the stuff?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
So in terms of tracking, what is the trend in your view? If you were to, you're sitting in your perch in Mexico City, it's 5 years from now. We are in a bit of a troubled time in terms of global economics and certainly the value of sustainability within certain political systems, many of whom shall remain nameless at this point. But what do you envision as the trend and the track? Will it continue to grow as it has been growing? And if not, what do you see as the big challenges? Again, I know it's a big question, but what do you think?
The short answer is I don't know, but I'm excited to
Mm,
find out.
Good. So you're optimistic?
I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded, because the underlying logic of the sustainability, the growth and sustainability, and corporate sustainability, the underlying logic is pretty sound, and it's also something that the market wants, right? The consumers want this. Consumers are concerned about it, so that dynamic's not gonna change. I think that what I don't want to say we because it's such a big space, and by no means am I a spokesman for anybody. But if I was to advise, I would say, you know what, ESG, take the feedback seriously. Do you know what I mean? And try to separate where there might be some lessons learned here too, because for example, the pain point I just mentioned of corporates that want to implement sustainability practices, but have limited resources. And by limited resources, I mean usually, in your financial reporting team, you've got your treasurer, you've got a few accountants, right? If you add to their burden, and that's uncomfortable. That's not helpful, right? If on the other hand, if you say, look, I want you to do this, and your metric is A, B, C, and D, then okay, I can handle it. I'll take care of it. But if there's moving metrics, then and if the metrics aren't clear, then that causes frustration and
Inefficiency and absolutely.
exactly right. So I would say, listen to the market feedback, listen to the market, take a pause and see what can we do to make this better? Because in many cases, it's just data. Do you know what I mean? It's just data. In other words, a lot of ESG and climate measurement and so forth, it's not a judgment call. It's just information, right? About what a company is doing. And so I think what might have caught a lot of people in the sustainability space off guard is when part of it was being when the pushback was political, and people were saying, well, that's not really what we meant. We didn't mean that. What we meant is we want to provide more information to help investors make better decisions and help managers manage risks better. But it didn't become, maybe the communication, there was a problem with communicating to the market, right? So if there's a way to take a pause and say, look, all that the ESG movement is doing is providing additional information to make good investment decisions and help risk managers manage risk better. And that's a good thing. That's helping people meet their fiduciary duty. That's helping capital owners make better decisions, make more well-informed decisions. If we can get to that point, then I think that the pushback will evaporate, right? Again, there's this issue of one of the ways of becoming of implementing sustainable investment or impact investment or what have you is by the exclusion method, right? The exclusion method. And I think that, maybe the no fossil fuels approach, although I understand, what climate activists are concerned about, obviously. But on the other hand, where, fossil fuel companies are still a big part of the local economy and so forth, and we need them. I think that why it might have been interpreted as something hostile, as opposed to something that's potentially beneficial for the entire energy spectrum, right? So I can understand that as well. So I'm very curious to see where it's going to go. Over the next 4 years. I think that, for example, sustainability has also resulted in a lot of jobs, right? I mean, there's the Inflation Reduction Act. Most of that money was spent in what are called, red states. If you look at the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and where a lot of this EV electric vehicle money has been spent, it's been spent in red states. So a lot of jobs and factories were put up in these red states. So I'd be very curious to see how what happens when that reality bubbles to the surface. That there's a lot of there's been a lot of economic benefit to a lot of Americans by the sustainability movement. So I'll be very interested to see how that conversation goes once that comes back into the limelight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to be sure to reserve a few minutes here for you to talk a little bit about awakened economics. And for me, it feels connected to what we're talking about in the sense, if I'm not missing something here, but in the sense that as businesses start to think that it's more than just about profits, or certainly short-term profits, we're playing a bigger game here. And we begin to question the priorities of business. And expand them, if you will. That's how I hear this topic. But then, how do we bring that over to even theories of economics and this notion of, can we question neoclassical economics, and what does that mean? I know that's something that's near and dear to your heart with your Awakened Economics column. And but tell us a little bit about that, please.
Well, the Awaken Economics is there the let's say the antagonist is not business. It's the way young students are taught economics today, right? So it's with theoretical economics, right? That's where if I had to choose an antagonist, what I'm looking to call attention to there is that the way theoretical economics are taught, and by the way, there can be a big disconnect between the business world and theoretical economics, a huge disconnect, right?
Right, right, exactly. In university, you're studying economics or you're studying business. There could be a big difference.
Exactly. They can be two different things, right? Especially in theoretical economics, which kind of tends to be in its own little glass bubble sometimes. But nonetheless, impressionable students are taught year in and year out, to this day, right now, even as we speak, a theory of economics called the neoclassical approach, right? And the neoclassical approach, read the blog. I trace out the whole history of it there, but its theoretical underpinnings are self-interest and maximization, right? And the idea is that you've heard this before, that it's Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? That people interacting in a free market, pursuing their own self-interests, have a positive societal benefit as a result, right? So if you let people interact freely in the market, pursuing their self-interest, and if you let companies interact freely in the market, pursuing their self-interest, society as a whole is going to benefit, right? And so that's the intellectual underpinning, right? But clearly that's not happened, right? I mean, there's really the idea of a free market is, you can wonder whether or not it really exists, right? Because you may have people involved in relationships of buying and selling, but what happens when, there's power relationships get involved in that? I mean, it is idealistic view. I don't think it reflects reality, because I say that if you teach kids that self-interest and maximization have to be the underpinnings of economic relationships, then what is the outcome of that? Well, the outcome of that is, I see a straight line between unbridled self-interest, pursuit of unbridled self-interest, and these huge disparities of wealth and opportunity that characterize the global economy and today, and maximization, same thing. It leads to huge disparities of wealth and opportunity, and I don't think that's healthy. and the climate crisis, the destruction of the
Mm-hmm.
planet,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I say, why are we teaching this to kids? Why do we continue to teach this model? And there's a whole series of rationalizations. Economists tell you, no, 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 that's just theory. It's not theory. So, okay, well, why don't you change the assumption? Why don't you change your inputs? And in Awakened Economics, that's where we turn to spirituality. And we say, well, instead of having the core of your economic theory be a utility maximizing, self-interested individual or a profit maximizing, self-interested company, why doesn't start point be a fully conscious human being? Why can't the start point be somebody that's fully conscious and that cares as much about the well-being of his or her neighbor, has a sense of empathy, compassion, generosity, tolerance, um, and have that be the start point, instead of having the start point be the self-interested utility maximizing consumer, which is the start point in neoclassical economics, right? So that's the theme that I'm developing in over the course of all the writing in Awakened Economics, right? And so that's it, right? Between that and I haven't in the blog so far, in the column so far, I haven't talked about the business world. Although in my I do have an awakened definition of economics. Economics is funny because there's no commonly agreed upon definition to economics right now. If you ask economists, what does economics mean? And if you ask them that in the 1950s versus today versus the time of Adam Smith, the definition has changed and changed and changed, right? So we have an awakened version of an awakened definition of economics that we propose. Give me 1 second here. I'm gonna raise my hand for the first time, and let me just, because I want to read this the definition that we propose for an awakened definition of economics. Just give me 1 second, and I'll tell you when you can. So the definition of economics, that we propose in the blog is economics is the study of interdependent relationships of material transformation and service for the attainment of sustainable human and planetary well-being. Okay, I know it's a little bit long, and I'll repeat it. Economics is the study of interdependent relationships of material transformation and service for the attainment of sustainable human and planetary well-being. So you see the word sustainability, it's in there, right? And each of those words is very carefully chosen. And if you, the unpacking of the definition is available in the blog. I have a couple of posts called "What is Economics?" and "Awakened Definition Part 1 and Part 2." Well-being, as opposed to utility maximization. We include both human beings and the planet in the definition. And rather than buyers and sellers, or reducing us to just consumers trying to maximize your utility, we talk about economic relationships, and that these are interdependent, right? So if I make a decision to pollute a stream, maybe I'm maximizing profits, but I'm also having a negative impact on the environment in which I operate. And those are the kind of questions and considerations that I want to encourage theoretical economists to take into account, and they do. Economics is theoretical or academic economics. It's a huge ecosystem as well. It's a huge undertaking. So I'm always very careful to make this clear, right? I'm not picking a fight with all of economics. That would be silly. And I've run across amazing economists too that feel the same way and are looking for alternatives to teach kids now. And if you ask young economic students, they're not too turned on by the neoclassical approach either. Yet it continues to be taught, and it continues to be taught, and it continues to be taught, right? So that's what I talk about in Awakened Economics. So I've kind of got my startup sustainability and my commitment to sustainability on the one side. That's a, in the real world, the practical world, the business world. And then I've got Awaken Economics, in which I try to contribute to the conversation about academic economics and what we can do to get to a healthier, more holistic approach to that craft too.
Beautiful. So if someone wanted to learn more about the sustainability market, it would be sustainarray.com, correct?
Yes, sustainarray.com.
Okay. And if someone wanted to learn more about Awakened Economics, it's Awakened Economics on Substack, or is there a more direct way, or what's the best?
No, it's long. It's Awakened Economics dash substack.com. So, but if you Google it, it'll come up.
Got it. No, beautiful.
Thank
Got
you
it.
for
And I
allowing me.
I appreciate your work on these various fronts. And I think what it circles back to for me is this notion of, do I want to be behaving in a world in a way that reflects some level of spiritual awareness, awakening, et cetera, or do I want to be operating in a world where something like that just would never even occur to me and I wouldn't aspire to it? It's a bit about
Exactly.
what
And
you
you're free to
talked about
choose.
at the beginning. Right, exactly. We're free to choose. That's totally fine. And that's, as we always are in this world with respect to anything quote unquote spiritual. And that's the beauty of it from my point of view. It's always a choice.
It's always a choice. Yeah.
How we
Yeah.
engage
No,
in so much of value in this life is always a choice.
it's always a choice. And we're free human beings. Each one of us is endowed with the same freedom, dignity, worth as the next person. So it's up to you. It's your journey. I respect the journey of every single person, every listener, it's up to you. And so all we do is try to contribute to the conversation and follow our own passions and hopefully contribute something positive to the world and along the way.
Well, thank you, Bond. I hear you doing that. I see you doing that. I look forward to continuing to read your columns and go, oh, that's right. I remember some of this econ stuff from undergrad. I'm happy to learn about it again. And I appreciate the voice that you have in the world and also the opportunities that you're taking to share that voice. So thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and wisdom and the invitation that you present.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm very grateful. I must say, this is the first time I've ever been on a podcast, so this is really exciting. Thank you for something brand new for me. Deeply grateful.
Lovely. No, I'm grateful for the experience. Doesn't sound like it's new. So good. Great to speak with you.
Okay, likewise. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Spirituality and Leadership. If you want to access this wealth of knowledge and insight on a regular basis, subscribe to the show. Join the network of leaders who want to do and be better. Visit the site at spiritualityandleadership.com to catch all the episodes and learn more. Until next time, take good care of yourself.